She married a loving husband until the wedding night changed everything. She stood in front of the mirror, her ivory wedding gown hugging her like a promise she wasn't sure she ever made. Everyone around her had been telling her how lucky she was to marry a man like Aidan, handsome, successful, charming. But even as the makeup artist pinned the last white rose in her hair, she couldn't shake the cold ache twisting in her stomach. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something darker, like her instincts were warning her she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. She tried to laugh it off, to blame the nerves on too much coffee and too little sleep, but her hands kept trembling no matter how tightly she clasped them. When the chapel doors opened, and she took her first step toward the man waiting at the altar, she looked into his eyes, and for a second, just one tiny, flickering second, she swore she saw something she couldn't name, something that made her throat tighten and her pulse skitter. But then he smiled, that perfect smile, the one that had melted every doubt she ever dared to speak out loud, and the guests sighed in admiration as if they all agreed he was the perfect groom. She forced her lips to curve up, ignoring how her heart was hammering like a trapped bird in her chest. Today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She had no idea it would be the beginning of her longest nightmare. She could still feel the weight of all those eyes watching her even after the chapel had emptied, even after the last congratulations had been whispered against her cheek. The reception was a golden haze of clinking glasses, camera flashes, and forced laughter. She kept glancing at Aidan, searching his face for that momentary shadow she'd seen in the church, but he looked so calm, so sure, so heartbreakingly handsome that she started to believe she'd imagined it. He held her hand the entire evening, his touch warm, possessive in a way that made her chest flutter and her stomach knot. Everyone kept telling her how lucky she was, how perfect they looked together, and she smiled until her cheeks burned. When the last guest finally left, the silence felt deafening. Aidan slid his hand along the small of her back as he guided her to the waiting car, his touch lingering just a moment too long. She told herself it was only nerves again, that it was normal to feel unsteady on a day like this. But as the driver pulled away and the mansion gates disappeared behind them, she turned to look at him in the dim glow of the car's interior light. "You're quiet," she whispered, trying to sound playful, hoping he would say something to ease the sudden tightness in her chest. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers in a stare that was so unblinking it made her breath catch. Then, so softly she almost thought she'd misheard, he said, "I've waited a long time for tonight." She tried to smile, but something in his voice felt hollow, like a door clicking shut in the dark. The rest of the ride he didn't touch her again, didn't speak, didn't even look her way, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself not to shiver. When they finally pulled up in front of his house, their house, she supposed he got out first, and for a moment he didn't offer his hand to help her. It was such a small thing, so easily brushed off as an accident, but it felt like the first crack in something she hadn't realized was already breaking. She gathered her skirts and stepped out on her own, her heels clicking against the stones like a warning she couldn't understand yet. Inside, the house was candlelit and silent. He turned to her then and smiled, but it was different this time, wider, colder, as if he were a stranger slipping into the face of the man she'd loved. "Welcome home," he murmured, and she felt the first true thread of fear curl tight in her chest. She stood in the entryway, her hand still resting on the polished banister as she tried to steady her breathing. The house was beautiful in a way that almost felt obscene, gleaming floors, vaulted ceilings, hundreds of candles flickering along every surface as if someone had spent hours arranging them. It should have been romantic, a perfect ending to a perfect wedding, but all she felt was a low, uneasy dread crawling beneath her skin. Aidan closed the front door behind them with a quiet click, the sound so final it made her flinch. She forced herself to look at him, searching for some trace of the man she thought she knew, but his expression was unreadable. "I'll show you where you'll be staying," he said softly. "Not we, you." The word lodged itself in her throat like a splinter. She followed him up the sweeping staircase, every step sounding too loud in the hushed space. He walked ahead without glancing back, his shoulders straight and measured, and for the first time she wondered if she had ever truly known him at all. At the end of the hallway, he stopped in front of a tall, wide door and turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Go on," he said, gesturing for her to open it. Her fingers trembled as she closed them around the brass handle, a chill rushing over her skin as she pushed the door inward. The room beyond was stark and almost eerily spotless: white walls, a massive four-poster bed draped in sheer fabric, a vanity she didn't recognize. There were no personal touches, no warmth, just cold perfection. She stepped inside, her heart beating so loud it felt like it was echoing through her skull. When she turned around, he was leaning in the doorway, watching her with that same unsettling calm. "You'll be comfortable here," he said, his voice smooth, almost kind. "Almost. If you need anything, you'll ask me directly." She swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sudden tightness in her chest. "This is my room?" she asked carefully. For a moment he didn't answer, just watched her with that unblinking gaze. Then he nodded once. "Yes, until I say otherwise." Her mouth went dry. "Until you say." But he had already turned and walked away, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click. She stared at the door, her hands clenched at her sides, feeling as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She tried the handle, half certain it would be locked, but it turned easily in her grasp. That almost made it worse, knowing she could leave the room but had nowhere else to go. She shut it again and pressed her forehead to the wood, fighting the cold ache in her stomach. She had married him because she loved him, because she believed in the life they were supposed to build together. But standing there in that silent, empty room, she realized that whatever she'd believed was already gone, and she was completely alone. She didn't know how long she stood there, her forehead resting against the door as she tried to steady her breathing. The quiet was so thick it felt like it might smother her. In the months they'd dated, Aidan had always been attentive, sometimes too attentive, if she was honest with herself. He'd insisted on picking her up from work, on knowing where she was every evening, on meeting every friend she mentioned. Back then, she'd told herself it was sweet, that he just cared too much. Now, in this cold, perfect house, she wondered if she'd mistaken obsession for devotion. With a shaky exhale, she finally moved away from the door and crossed to the bed. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender, but somehow that only made her feel more uneasy, as if everything here had been staged for a version of her that didn't exist. She sat down and tried to gather her thoughts, telling herself she was overreacting, that it was just the stress of the wedding, that tomorrow everything would feel normal again. But deep down, she knew something had shifted, and she couldn't name it without feeling like her chest was going to crack open. The night dragged on in agonizing quiet. Hours seemed to bleed into one another as she sat there, too restless to lie down, too afraid to leave. It was nearly dawn by the time she heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway toward her door. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs, and the handle turned. Aidan stepped inside, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face eerily calm. For a moment, he just stood there looking at her, and she felt something in her spine go rigid. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" he asked in a low voice. She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. I didn't know if I should wait for you." He smiled then, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course you should wait for me. That's what a good wife does." Her mouth went dry, and she instinctively shifted back on the bed. He watched her closely, as if measuring every flinch, every breath. Then he came closer, each step slow, deliberate. He reached out, and she almost recoiled before she caught herself. He traced one finger along her jaw, so lightly it made her shiver. "Don't look so afraid," he murmured. "You're mine now. Nothing will hurt you, unless I decide it should." A chill unfurled inside her, rooting itself deep in her chest. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, and it took every ounce of willpower not to pull away. "Get some sleep," he said softly, straightening up. "We have a long life ahead of us." Then he turned and left as quietly as he'd entered, the door closing behind him with that same soft, final click. She didn't move, didn't blink. She sat there in the lavender-scented darkness, her pulse roaring in her ears, and understood whatever she'd stepped into, It wasn't a marriage. It was a cage. When the morning light finally crept across the floor, she hadn't slept at all. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded tight in her lap as though she could hold herself together by sheer force of will. Everything about this house was immaculate and silent, like a museum built for someone else's life. She wondered if he had always intended it to be this way, if every polished surface and candlelit hallway was just another part of whatever plan he'd had before she ever walked down that aisle. When she heard footsteps again, her body tensed so hard her shoulders ached. The door opened without a knock. Aidan stood in the doorway wearing a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly combed, as if the night before had never happened. He looked her over with calm scrutiny, his gaze pausing on her rumpled dress and pale face. "You're not ready," he observed, his voice flat. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt raw. "Ready for what?" He stepped inside and set a tray on the vanity, the porcelain dishes clinking too loudly in the hush. "Breakfast," he said, as though it were obvious. "And after that, you'll dress appropriately. We're having guests this evening." She blinked at him, her stomach clenching. "Guests? Of course," he said mildly, as if they were any other newlyweds. "Everyone wants to congratulate us. I expect you to behave as a proper wife should." She gripped the edge of the mattress, her palms damp. "Aidan, I think we need to talk." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then came closer until he stood over her. She had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes, and her heart stuttered when she saw the hardness there, like polished stone. "I've told you before," he murmured, his tone so gentle it made her skin crawl. "There's nothing to discuss. You married me. This is your life now." She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. He brushed his thumb along her cheek, and the touch made her shiver. "Eat," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Then get dressed. I expect you to look perfect tonight." He turned and left, shutting the door with that soft click she was beginning to hate more than any slam. She sat there staring at the tray of food she couldn't imagine choking down, her pulse racing like she'd run miles. In that moment, she finally admitted to herself that she'd never been in love with Aidan as he really was. She'd been in love with the version he'd shown her, the man he'd invented to pull her in, the man who had vanished the instant the vows were spoken. She wrapped her arms around her waist, feeling smaller than she ever had, and tried not to think about what would happen tonight when she had to pretend everything was normal. When evening came, she barely recognized herself in the gilded mirror propped against the wall. Her hair was twisted up in a smooth, elegant knot, pinned with pearls she didn't remember ever owning. The silk dress Aidan had left for her clung to her body in a way that made her feel exposed, like she was on display. She wanted to rip it off, to crawl under the blankets and disappear, but she knew he would never allow that. In the quiet hour before the guests arrived, she sat in the vanity chair, trying to slow her breathing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face hovering over her in the dark, that cold smile curving his mouth as if he were savoring a private joke. A soft knock startled her so badly she nearly toppled the chair. The door opened a moment later, and Aidan stepped in, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that made his pale eyes look even sharper. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. He just studied her in silence, gaze drifting from her face to the trembling hands folded in her lap. Finally, he nodded, almost to himself. "Perfect," he murmured, as though she were an ornament he'd arranged exactly the way he liked. She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to tell him she felt like she was suffocating. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered before she could stop herself. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw something almost human flicker, their weariness, maybe, or regret. But then it was gone, replaced by that smooth, impenetrable calm. "Because," he said softly, stepping closer until the hem of his jacket brushed her knees, "you are mine, and I take care of what belongs to me." Her stomach twisted. He reached out and smoothed the stray hair behind her ear, and the tenderness of the gesture made her shiver. "Smile tonight," he said, bending until his mouth hovered beside her cheek. "If you embarrass me in front of our guests, I will not be forgiving." Her throat closed, and she managed the barest nod. "Good girl," he murmured, pressing a cool kiss against her temple. He straightened and offered his hand. "Let's not keep everyone waiting." She slipped her hand into his because she had no choice, feeling the pressure of his fingers curling around hers, possessive and final. Together, they descended the staircase, her steps wooden, her heart thudding dully against her ribs. The foyer glowed with soft lamplight, and the front door stood open, voices drifting in from the drive where cars were arriving. Aidan smiled as he guided her forward, and she knew, in that instant, she had never been further from safety in her entire life. The first guests were already stepping inside when they reached the bottom of the stairs. Aidan's grip on her hand tightened, just enough to make her fingers tingle. To anyone watching, they probably looked like the perfect newlyweds, all poise and grace. But inside, she felt hollow, as if something essential had been scraped clean out of her chest. He introduced her to each couple with a polished ease that made her skin crawl, his voice warm and gracious. She tried to mirror his composure, tried to smile when people congratulated her, when they squeezed her hand and told her how lucky she was to have married such a good man. Every time someone praised him, it felt like another stone settling on her ribs. She wondered if any of them could see it, how tightly he held her, how her voice trembled when she thanked them. But no one seemed to notice. They only smiled wider, delighted by the spectacle of her in her beautiful dress and Aidan standing so close, his arm possessive around her waist. The evening blurred into a procession of champagne glasses and polite conversation. She stood beside him, nodding and smiling and wishing she could disappear. Once, when she thought no one was watching, she tried to ease out of his hold. His fingers dug into her hip, a warning so subtle she doubted anyone else noticed. She went, still again, her heart stuttering in her chest. Hours passed that way, each one more suffocating than the last. At some point she excused herself to the powder room, desperate for a moment alone. She locked the door behind her and pressed her palms to the marble countertop, trying to catch her breath. In the mirror, her reflection looked pale and brittle, like she might shatter if someone touched her. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She couldn't show weakness, not here, not while he could find her at any moment. She swallowed hard and turned on the tap, splashing cold water on her cheeks. For one wild moment, she imagined climbing out the tiny window, running barefoot down the dark road until she was far away from all of this. But she knew she wouldn't make it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. A soft knock at the door made her jump so hard she nearly cried out. She turned slowly, her damp hands clenched against her skirt. "Everything all right in there?" Aidan's voice, soft and deceptively tender, slid through the door. "Yes," she called back, forcing her voice not to crack. "I'll be out in a moment." Silence. Then, very quietly, "Don't keep me waiting." She squeezed her eyes shut, her pulse hammering. She counted to 10, then 20, before she finally unlocked the door. He was waiting in the hallway, his smile as polished as ever. When she stepped past him, he rested his hand at the small of her back, guiding her back to the party. She knew then that she wasn't just trapped in this house. She was trapped in a life she hadn't agreed to, a marriage she didn't understand, and there was no one coming to save her. The rest of the evening passed in a haze so thick she could hardly remember the faces of the people she spoke to. Everything blurred together: glasses of champagne she didn't want, polite questions she answered on autopilot, the weight of Aidan's hand steady and unrelenting at her waist. She kept glancing at the door, imagining herself walking out into the night, imagining the first deep breath of freedom. But every time the thought took shape, she felt the phantom pressure of his fingers tightening on her arm, reminding her that he was always watching. Near midnight, the last guests finally drifted out into the dark, their voices fading down the steps. She stood beside Aidan in the entryway as he thanked each one with that same effortless charm. When the final car drove away, the hush that fell over the house was worse than any noise. It was the quiet of something final, the silence after a door had been bolted shut. Aidan closed the front door and turned the lock with a soft, deliberate click. The sound made her stomach turn. He didn't say anything as he stepped closer, reaching to brush a curl away from her face. She stiffened, but forced herself to stay still. His thumb grazed her cheekbone, lingering as if he liked feeling how tense she was. "You were beautiful tonight," he said in that smooth, careful voice. "Everyone could see what a perfect wife you are." Her mouth was so dry she could barely swallow. "I tried," she whispered. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, approval, maybe, or satisfaction. Then he leaned down, his mouth brushing her ear. "I hope you understand now," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. "You belong here, with me. That will never change." She closed her eyes, hating how her heart lurched at his nearness. She didn't trust herself to answer, so she just nodded, wishing he would step away. But he didn't. He straightened slowly, his hand sliding down her arm until it circled her wrist in a grip that was gentle and absolute. Without another word, he led her back up the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. She felt like a child being taken to her room for punishment, though she didn't even know what she'd done wrong. In front of her bedroom door, he stopped. His eyes searched her face, and she thought for an instant that he might say something human, something that would make sense of all of this. But he didn't. He only lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. "Sleep well," he murmured, and there was something in his tone that made her chest tighten with dread. She stepped into the room, her skin crawling, and he shut the door behind her without another glance. She waited, listening to his retreating footsteps until she could no longer hear them. Then she backed away from the door and sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't. She needed all her strength for whatever was coming next. The hours after he left stretched out like an endless corridor she couldn't escape. She sat in the dark with her back pressed to the headboard, every muscle tight as she listened for any sound that might mean he was coming back. Once or twice she thought she heard footsteps outside her door, but when she held her breath and strained to listen, there was nothing but silence. She wished she knew what he was thinking when he looked at her with that cold approval, wished she could understand why this was happening. But every time she tried to piece it together, his possessive calm, the way he'd planned everything so perfectly, a deeper fear threaded through her thoughts. What if he'd never loved her at all? What if he'd only been waiting for this? For the moment she couldn't leave? When dawn finally softened the edges of the room, she was still awake, her eyes dry and aching. She didn't move until the house stirred to life, someone moving in the kitchen, the muffled thud of a door closing far away. She slipped out of bed and crossed to the vanity, bracing her hands on the cool marble. In the mirror, she looked hollow. The dress she'd worn for the party was wrinkled and clinging to her in unflattering lines, her hair falling out of its careful twist. She looked like someone who'd been left behind. She splashed water on her face and combed her hair back with shaking fingers, desperate to feel like she had some control. But no matter how she tried to compose herself, the hollow dread didn't fade. A soft knock on the door made her flinch so hard she nearly dropped the comb. She swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Yes?" The door eased open and a woman in a navy uniform stepped just inside, bowing her head politely. "Mr. Aidan asked me to bring you breakfast," she said in a gentle voice. Her hands were pale and slender, gripping the tray as if she wished she could set it down and leave. For a second, hope flared in her chest. Maybe this woman could help her. Maybe she could slip her a message or call anyone. But when she lifted her gaze, she saw the same resignation she felt reflected in the woman's tired eyes. This wasn't just her prison. It was everyone's. "Thank you," she murmured, and the woman nodded, setting the tray on the small table near the window. She hesitated, as if she might say more, but in the end she only bowed again and retreated, closing the door behind her. She waited until the soft click of the latch sounded before crossing to the tray. The sight of the perfectly arranged breakfast porcelain teapot, tiny vase with a single white rose made her stomach twist. She wasn't hungry. She didn't think she'd ever be hungry in this place. She turned to the window instead, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Outside, the gardens were bathed in pale morning light, beautiful and empty. Somewhere in that quiet, she made herself a promise she would find a way out, even if it took everything she had left. She stayed by the window long after the tea had gone cold and the sun had climbed higher, painting the gardens in soft gold. From this angle, The world outside looked so deceptively free, paths winding through rose bushes, tall hedges at the perimeter that almost seemed like a challenge to cross. She pressed her fingertips harder against the glass, wishing she could step out onto the grass and walk away without looking back. But she knew even if she tried, she wouldn't get far. She'd seen the discreet cameras hidden in the corners of the house, the silent staff who never quite met her eyes. Everyone here seemed to know exactly who was in charge. The thought made her feel both small and furious. A knock interrupted her, and this time she didn't flinch. She turned as the door opened and Aidan walked in, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked like the man she'd fallen for in all the ways that didn't matter anymore, so composed, so careful. It struck her that she had never seen him caught off guard, not once. "You didn't eat," he observed, his gaze flicking to the untouched tray. She didn't bother pretending. "I wasn't hungry." He studied her for a long moment, and she braced for anger or disappointment. But when he spoke, his voice was almost soft. "You'll have to get used to this, you know." "Used to what?" she asked, her voice low. "To being here, to being my wife." He crossed the room, stopping just close enough that she could feel the heat of him, but not touching her. "The sooner you accept it, the easier this will be." Her throat tightened. "Accept what? That I'm your property?" His jaw ticked, the first crack in his composure she'd ever seen. For a second she thought he might shout or grab her, but instead he took a slow breath and smoothed his expression back into place. "Don't say things like that," he said quietly. "You're here because you belong here." She shook her head, her pulse thudding against her collarbone. "No, I'm here because you made me think you were someone you're not." His eyes didn't waver. "You don't understand yet, but you will." He reached for her hand and she jerked back before she could stop herself. His face went still, and a coldness slid into his gaze that made her shiver. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back, smoothing his cuffs as if nothing had happened. "Get dressed," he said, his voice flat. "We have a dinner engagement tonight." "I'm not going," she whispered, her heart hammering. He looked at her like she'd said something childish. "You are," he said simply, "and you'll smile. You'll act like a wife." He turned to leave, then paused with his hand on the door. "Because if you don't," he added, his tone so calm it made her stomach twist, "I will make sure you regret it." And with that, he slipped out into the hallway, shutting the door with that same quiet finality. She stood there, her breath coming in shallow bursts, every part of her shaking. She knew then that he wasn't going to let her go. And if she wanted to survive this, she couldn't let him see how afraid she really was. She stood in the center of the room, feeling the walls closing in around her with every heartbeat. His words kept echoing in her head, wrapping around her throat like invisible hands. "I will make sure you regret it." She pressed her palms against her cheeks, trying to force herself to breathe normally, but nothing felt normal anymore. Even the sunlight pouring across the floor looked wrong, too bright against the cold perfection of this house. When she finally moved, it was only because she couldn't stand being still. She went to the wardrobe and opened it, half expecting to find nothing but empty hangers. But it was full rows of dresses, pressed blouses, soft wool sweaters in colors she never would have chosen for herself. She ran her hand over the fabric and felt another piece of herself splinter. He'd prepared everything. Even before she'd said "I do," he'd planned exactly how she would live, what she would wear, how she would smile. She picked the simplest dress she could find, a long navy shift that at least felt less like a costume, and changed slowly, her hands trembling as she buttoned it closed. She didn't bother with makeup. She didn't care if he thought she looked tired or sad. Let him see it. Let him see what he'd done. Hours passed in a slow crawl until the sky outside the windows began to darken. Every time she thought she heard footsteps, her heart leapt into her throat. She forced herself to sit in the chair by the window, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the gardens. It felt like the only way to keep herself from breaking. When the door opened again, she didn't turn. She heard him step inside, felt the weight of his silence behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he crossed the room and stood just behind her shoulder. "You look lovely," he said quietly. His voice was so close she could feel the warmth of it against her ear. She didn't answer. She wouldn't give him that. A pause. Then his fingers brushed her shoulder, gentle as a caress. I hope you'll remember what I said. She stared straight ahead, refusing to let him see how her pulse jumped. I remember. Good. He let his hand fall, but she didn't dare relax. Our guests will be here soon. You'll join me downstairs. Still she didn't turn. What if I don't? She asked, her voice as flat as she could make it. He was silent for a moment, and the quiet felt more dangerous than any threat. When he finally spoke, his tone was so soft it made her skin crawl. Then I will come back up here, and you won't like what happens next. She closed her eyes, pressing her lips together to keep them from shaking. She heard him step away, heard the door open and close, and only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding. For the first time since she'd walked down that aisle, she felt the weight of it, how completely she'd disappeared into this life she hadn't chosen. She pressed her palm to the window, feeling the cold seep into her skin. No one was coming to save her. She would have to find her own way out. When the knock finally came, she was already standing by the door, hands clasped tight at her waist to hide how badly they were shaking. Aidan didn't bother waiting for her permission. He stepped inside, as if the space had always belonged to him, his expression calm, almost polite. He took one look at her and nodded in quiet approval, as though she were an arrangement he'd ordered exactly to specification. You're ready, he said simply. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she only inclined her head. For a moment, he studied her face as though he was searching for something, fear maybe, or defiance. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he stepped aside and gestured to the hallway. After you. She walked past him, every step measured, her gaze fixed on the carpet runner as she tried to ignore the way her pulse was hammering. She knew if she looked back, if she saw that cold triumph in his eyes, she might turn around and run. And there was nowhere left to run. The staircase was lit with dozens of candles, flickering along the banister and casting long shadows that danced across the walls. It was beautiful in a way that felt obscene, like a celebration she hadn't agreed to. When she reached the bottom step, she paused, steadying herself. Aidan's hand came to rest lightly at her lower back, guiding her forward, and she had to bite down hard on the inside of her cheek to stop herself from flinching. The sitting room was already filling with people, elegant women in jeweled gowns, men in tailored suits, everyone smiling and murmuring in low, approving voices. It struck her, all at once, how expertly he had built this life, the perfect house, the perfect gatherings, the perfect illusion. And she was just another piece of it, another thing he could show off. You remember Charles and Elise, he said, his voice smooth as silk. She didn't, but she nodded anyway, because that was what he expected. Elise stepped forward and kissed her cheek, her perfume so strong it made her eyes water. Darling, you look radiant, she gushed. Marriage clearly suits you. She swallowed hard and forced a smile. Thank you. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Aidan's arm slipped around her waist, holding her close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her dress. To the room, it must have looked affectionate, possessive in that charming way people always praised in a husband. But she knew it was a warning, a reminder that he was always right there watching. The evening unfolded in a blur of polite laughter and practiced pleasantries. Every time she hesitated, every time her gaze drifted too far or her voice trembled, Aidan's hand would tighten at her hip, just enough to make her remember. Hours later, when the last guests finally left and the door closed on their congratulations, she felt like she'd been hollowed out. He turned to her then, his expression soft, almost tender. You did very well tonight, he murmured. She stared up at him, searching his face for any trace of the man she'd thought she'd married. But all she saw was the stranger she was beginning to realize he'd always been. I'm tired, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I'd like to go to bed. For a moment, he only looked at her, his pale eyes unblinking. Then he smiled, and she thought she might be sick. Of course, he said. He bent to kiss her cheek, and she stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. When he drew back, she turned without waiting for him to dismiss her, climbing the stairs on unsteady legs. She didn't look back to see if he was watching. She already knew he was. She didn't let herself cry until she was safely behind her bedroom door, the latch clicking into place with that soft, merciless finality. Even then, she pressed her knuckles to her mouth to muffle the sounds, terrified he might be listening from the hall. The tears came hot and fast, unstoppable, and she sank onto the edge of the bed as her shoulders shook. She thought of the woman she'd been just days ago, standing in front of a mirror in a white dress, believing she was about to start a life built on love. Believing she'd finally found someone who saw her, really saw her, and chose her anyway. Now she knew he hadn't chosen her at all. He'd claimed her, the way someone claims a house or a piece of land. Something to own, to control, to bend into the shape he wanted. The realization hollowed her out so completely she felt she might never be whole again. When the worst of the sobs finally passed, she wiped her face with shaking hands. She knew she couldn't stay in this room all night, curled up and waiting for whatever he would decide to do next. If she was going to survive this, she had to find a way to keep herself sane, to hold on to something that still belonged only to her. She crossed to the small writing desk in the corner and pulled out the bottom drawer. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, blank and crisp, probably meant for jotting down household expenses or guest lists. She opened it and stared at the first empty page. Her hand hovered over it for a long time before she finally picked up the pen. At the top, in careful block letters, she wrote, "If something happens to me, this is what you need to know." The words looked stark and final in the dim lamplight. For a moment she thought she might start crying again, but she forced herself to keep going. She wrote down everything she could remember: how he'd changed the moment the wedding was over, how he controlled who she spoke to and where she went, the way he smiled when he threatened her. She wrote about the staff who never met her eyes, about the cameras tucked discreetly in the corners, about the dinners where she was expected to pretend she was happy. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, if it would ever make it past these walls, but the act of writing it down felt like a tiny rebellion, a piece of herself he hadn't stolen yet. By the time she set the pen down, her eyes were burning with exhaustion. She closed the notebook carefully, hiding it beneath a stack of folded linens in the bottom drawer. Then she rose, turned out the lamp, and climbed into the cold bed. Lying there in the darkness, she listened for footsteps, for the creak of the floorboards outside her door. But the house was silent. That was somehow worse. She pulled the blankets up to her chin and forced her eyes to stay open, watching the faint strip of light beneath the door. She wouldn't let herself fall asleep, not yet, because no matter how tired she was, she knew she had to be ready when he decided to come back. The hours crawled by in suffocating silence. Every time the pipes creaked or the old wood settled with a sigh, she held her breath, waiting for the knob to turn and the door to open. But no one came. When dawn finally broke, painting a dull gray across the walls, she felt as if she hadn't slept in years. Her eyes were dry and aching, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but she couldn't let herself rest. If she closed her eyes, she might not be able to wake up again. She pushed back the blankets and sat on the edge of the bed, her bare feet braced against the cold floor. For a long time, she just sat there, her gaze fixed on the pale rectangle of the window. She knew this was how it would be now: days spent pretending, nights spent waiting. Slowly, mechanically, she dressed in a simple cream blouse and a long skirt, her hands moving as if they belonged to someone else. She didn't know what time he would come for her, but she had learned already that he would expect her to be ready. When she finished, she crossed to the desk and opened the bottom drawer just enough to see the corner of the notebook tucked beneath the linens. She didn't touch it. Just seeing it there, hidden and safe, made her feel a little steadier, a little more like herself. She moved to the window and looked down into the garden. The roses were in bloom, a riot of pale color against the hedges. For a moment, she imagined walking barefoot across the grass, feeling the morning dew on her skin. She imagined the gate swinging open and her body passing through it, light and unburdened. The ache in her chest tightened until it felt like it might split her open. A soft knock at the door made her breath catch. She turned, her pulse thudding painfully in her throat. The door opened a fraction, and the same quiet woman from yesterday stepped inside, carrying a folded linen napkin over her arm. Her gaze flicked up just long enough to meet hers, And something passed between them, some silent understanding neither of them dared to name. "Breakfast," she said softly, setting the tray on the small table by the window. Her hands lingered a moment on the handles. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. The woman's eyes softened, but she didn't reply. She only straightened and turned to leave. At the threshold, she paused. Without looking back, she spoke in a voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "I'm sorry." The door closed before she could answer, and the word hung in the air like smoke. She crossed to the tray and lifted the silver lid, though she already knew she wouldn't eat. Every bite would taste like obedience. Instead, she carried the tray to the writing desk and set it aside. Then she took the notebook out again, opening it to a clean page. Today, she wrote only one sentence: "I am still here." And as the morning light grew stronger, she told herself she would keep writing it every day if she had to. Because no matter what he did, no matter how small he tried to make her, she would not disappear. She set the pen down and pressed her palm over the words she'd just written, as if she could anchor herself to them. "I am still here." It felt like the only truth she had left. Her heartbeat gradually slowed, the haze of fear lifting just enough that she could take a deeper breath. She straightened, smoothing her skirt, and closed the notebook. When she tucked it back beneath the linens, her hands were steadier. It wasn't much a hidden journal, a sentence of defiance, but it was something that belonged only to her. And that was more than he could ever understand. A soft chime sounded in the hall, the grandfather clock striking 9. She braced herself. He was never late. Sure enough, footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. The knock was gentle, but she felt it in her spine like the crack of a whip. She forced her face into something calm before she spoke. "Come in." Oidon entered with a smile that made her skin prickle. He looked like he'd slept perfectly, every detail of his appearance immaculate. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world existed for his benefit. When he saw her standing by the window, his eyes warmed, as if he truly thought this was all perfectly natural. "Good morning," he said, closing the door behind him. She didn't answer. He didn't seem to mind. He stepped closer, studying her as if he were assessing a prize. "You look rested," he observed. She held his gaze, though it took everything she had not to look away. "What do you want, Oidon?" His brows lifted slightly. "To have breakfast with my wife." He gestured to the untouched tray. "You haven't eaten." "I'm not hungry." He let out a small sigh, as though her reluctance was a tiresome inconvenience. "You need to take better care of yourself," he murmured, and the way he said it made her stomach twist, like she was a pet that had forgotten its place. He moved to stand behind her, so close she felt the heat of his body along her back. When he laid his hand on her shoulder, she went rigid, but he only squeezed lightly, a false reassurance. "You'll eat," he said quietly, "and tonight, we have guests again." She stared out the window, forcing her voice to stay even. "Every night? Until people understand how happy we are," he said. She heard the smile in his tone. "It's important." She almost laughed at that sharp and bitter, but she swallowed it down. Happy. The word meant nothing anymore. He waited, as if expecting her to argue. When she didn't, he gave her shoulder another soft squeeze and stepped away. "I'll see you at dinner." He turned for the door, then paused. "And darling," her skin crawled at the endearment. She finally looked at him. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Don't embarrass me." When he was gone, she let out a shuddering breath, her hands curling into fists. She went to the window again, staring out over the garden's perfect hedges. Maybe he thought he'd broken her already, that she was too frightened to fight back. But in that moment, something inside her hardened into resolve. She would pretend. She would smile when he told her to smile and sit beside him at every dinner. She would do everything he demanded until the day she found the door he'd forgotten to lock. And when she did, she would run so far he'd never find her again. The thought carried her through the rest of the day like a fragile shield, this quiet, desperate hope that somewhere beyond these walls, there was still a version of her life untouched by him. She stayed by the window until her legs ached, watching the gardeners trim the roses she would never be allowed to pick, the breeze stirring the leaves in a way that felt almost mocking. Every so often, she imagined herself walking through the grass past the hedges, out into the world where no one called her darling in that cold, possessive voice. When afternoon faded into early evening, she forced herself to move. If she was going to survive this, if she was going to have any chance at escaping, she needed to keep him convinced she was learning her place. She washed her face, smoothing away the evidence of another day spent crying, and changed into the soft blue dress that had been laid out for her. The color was gentle, almost innocent, as though wearing it would make her forget who she was and what he'd done. She brushed her hair until it gleamed and studied her reflection, practicing the careful, empty smile she knew he wanted. When she heard the knock this time, her heart still jumped, but she didn't let it show. She turned as the door opened and Aidan stepped inside, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn the night before. His eyes swept over her, assessing, and after a tense moment, he nodded. "Beautiful," he said quietly. She dipped her chin, her voice steady. "Thank you." He smiled, and she had to fight the urge to flinch. "Better," he murmured. "Much better." He offered his arm as if this were some elegant ritual, a performance for invisible guests. And in a way, it was. Everything with him was theater. She slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, her skin crawling when his fingers closed over hers. He guided her down the hall, his pace measured, never hurried. It felt like walking into a cage she was expected to decorate with flowers and call home. The sitting room was already bright with lamplight, the table set for 8. Crystal glasses gleamed, silver cutlery perfectly arranged. She recognized a few faces, people she'd met once, maybe twice, in the months before the wedding. They were all smiling, polite and curious, and none of them seemed to notice the way Aidan's hand never left her arm. "Everyone is so eager to meet you again," he murmured as he led her to her seat. "They all think we're very happy." She swallowed the bitter taste in her mouth and managed a nod. "I'm sure they do." He bent close so that only she could hear. "Don't forget it." Then he straightened, his expression shifting instantly to warmth and charm as he turned to their guests. For the next hour, she smiled when he looked at her, spoke when she was spoken to, and lifted her glass when someone proposed a toast. On the surface, she was every inch the perfect wife, serene, devoted, grateful. But inside, she was counting every second, measuring each moment she survived as proof that she was stronger than he knew. And when she finally caught her own reflection in the polished silver of a serving tray, she didn't see the broken girl she'd felt like this morning. She saw a woman who was going to leave this place, even if it meant burning every lie he'd built around her to the ground. As the dinner dragged on, she felt like she was moving through water, every smile slow and deliberate, every polite laugh taking more effort than the last. The guests chattered happily, oblivious to the way Aidan's hand rested possessively on the back of her chair, his thumb brushing the curve of her shoulder every time she took too long to answer a question. "And when will you two start thinking about children?" one of the women asked brightly, her voice sweet with curiosity. Her stomach twisted. She felt Aidan glance at her before he replied, his tone smooth and warm. "In time. We have plenty of years ahead of us." She lowered her gaze to her plate, praying no one would notice how her hands trembled in her lap. Children. The thought made her feel sick. She couldn't imagine bringing an innocent life into this prison, couldn't imagine what it would mean to be bound to him forever through something she could never walk away from. Someone laughed, the conversation drifting to other topics. She forced herself to look up, to smile as if she hadn't just felt the floor drop out from under her. But when her eyes met Aidan's, she knew he'd felt her flinch. His smile widened a fraction, and something cold flickered their satisfaction, as if he was daring her to contradict him in front of their guests. She didn't. She sipped her wine instead, tasting nothing. Later, when the last guest finally slipped out into the night, she stood in the doorway beside Aidan as he offered polite goodbyes. Her face felt stiff from smiling. She kept her gaze fixed on the far end of the dark driveway, imagining what it would be like to just start walking, to keep walking until the house disappeared behind her and she could finally breathe. When the door shut and the silence settled around them again, she felt her shoulders sag with exhaustion. She turned, hoping to retreat upstairs before he could speak, but his hand closed gently around her wrist. "Stay," he murmured. Her throat went tight. I'm tired. His thumb traced a slow circle against her skin, and, though he was still smiling, his voice was softer than ever. I know you are, but you need to understand something. She didn't move. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, close enough that if she breathed too shallowly she would shatter. This life, he said, his eyes locked on hers, is yours now, and I am yours. The sooner you accept that, the easier everything will be. She swallowed, willing her voice not to crack. You don't get to decide that for me. His smile didn't falter, but his grip tightened just enough to make her wince. I already have. And then he released her so suddenly she almost stumbled. He turned away as though nothing had happened, his voice calm as he said, Go upstairs. I'll join you shortly. She climbed the steps on shaking legs, her vision swimming. She didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending. But, as she reached the top of the stairs and looked back down at him standing in the golden glow of the entryway so composed, so certain she belonged to him, she knew one thing with a clarity that made her heart pound. Someday, she would prove him wrong. In the privacy of her bedroom, she finally let her mask fall. She leaned against the door, pressing her forehead to the wood, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Her pulse still thumped painfully in her wrist where he'd held her. She could almost feel the ghost of his touch, like bruises beneath her skin. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the dress from her body, to shatter every perfect thing in this house just to remind herself she was still alive, still capable of wanting something other than his control. But she didn't move. She couldn't, because any noise, any sign of defiance, might bring him up the stairs faster. Instead, she walked slowly to the vanity and sat down. Her reflection looked back at her hair pinned neatly, face pale, eyes too bright. A stranger. She lifted a trembling hand to her throat and pressed her fingers to the fluttering pulse there. You're still here, she thought, swallowing hard. You're still you. But it was harder to believe than it had been that morning. The minutes stretched on, every creak in the old house making her flinch. She didn't know when he'd come, only that he would. She could feel it like a storm building pressure in the air. She turned her gaze to the window. Outside, the garden lay quiet and silvered with moonlight. The gate was just visible beyond the hedges, half hidden in shadow. It looked so close, so deceptively reachable. If she tried to run tonight barefoot, with nothing but the clothes on her back, maybe she could make it to the road. Maybe she could flag down a passing car. She imagined what it would feel like to slip out that door and never look back. To leave him here in this cold, perfect house with all his plans unraveling around him. Her heart surged, and for the first time in days, she felt something like hope. The handle of the bedroom door turned. She spun to face it. Her breath caught in her throat. Aidan stepped inside. His jacket was gone. His shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms. He looked almost casual, as if this were any other night between husband and wife. But his eyes were steady, watchful. He closed the door behind him with a soft click. Why are you standing? He asked mildly, as though it mattered to him. She swallowed. I was thinking. He studied her, and she wondered if he could see the truth written all over her face, that she was counting the steps to the window, measuring the seconds it would take to unlatch the sill and drop into the garden. About what? He asked. She lifted her chin. About leaving. Silence pulled between them, heavy and suffocating. Then he smiled, and her stomach turned to ice. You won't, he said softly, stepping closer, because you understand that you can't. Her hands clenched at her sides. You can't keep me here forever. He reached out and traced a finger along her jaw, the touch almost tender. I can, he murmured, and I will. For a moment, she thought she might collapse under the weight of it, this certainty he carried, the conviction that no one would ever help her. But then something colder and sharper than fear rose up in her chest. Watch me, she thought, though she didn't dare say it aloud, because even if she had to wait a year, 10 years, she would find a way out. And when she did, she would burn this house down in her memory so thoroughly that nothing of him would remain. She held his gaze and didn't look away. His hand lingered against her cheek, and she forced herself not to shrink from it. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction, wouldn't let him see how the softness of his touch horrified her more than any slap ever could, because it was calculated everything. about him was, slowly, he let his hand drop, but he didn't step back. He stood so close she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar on his chin she'd once thought made him look boyish. Now she knew better. There was nothing harmless about him. "You'll learn," he said quietly, almost as if he were consoling her. "This fight in you, it's temporary. A person can't survive on defiance alone. Eventually, you'll understand this life is better than whatever you're imagining." Better. The word tasted poisonous. She swallowed, steadying her voice. "You don't know me as well as you think." A flicker of amusement passed across his face. "I know you perfectly," he murmured, brushing a stray hair back from her forehead. "And I know that tonight, you're going to stay here, and you're going to rest, and in the morning you'll thank me for protecting you from your own foolish ideas." He said it so calmly, so matter of fact, that for a heartbeat she almost believed it. Almost. But then she looked into his pale eyes, and she knew she would never thank him. She would never belong to him the way he wanted. And no matter how long it took, she would never stop trying to leave. He seemed to sense her thoughts, because his mouth curved in that smile she'd come to dread. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we'll be busy." Without waiting for her reply, he turned and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. She stood frozen until she was sure he wouldn't come back. Only then did she let herself sink onto the edge of the bed. Her whole body was trembling, but inside, something was hardening into steel. She would pretend. She would smile and nod and sit beside him like the obedient wife he wanted. But she would not forget who she was. She would not let him convince her that her spirit was something he could train out of her. Tomorrow, she would play her part. But tonight, she turned back to the window and pressed her palm to the cold glass, imagining the darkness beyond the hedges and the road that waded past the garden gate. "I'm still here," she thought, "and you will never break me." The next morning, she rose before dawn. She didn't wait for the knock or the soft voice telling her breakfast was ready. She washed her face, dressed in a simple gray dress that wouldn't catch on anything if she had to run, and braided her hair back so it wouldn't fly into her eyes. Her hands shook as she worked, but her mind was clear in a way it hadn't been since the night of the wedding. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the frightened girl he expected to find here. She saw someone who had survived every silent humiliation, every threat hidden behind a smile. Someone who still knew her own name. When the sun finally crept over the garden, she stood by the window waiting. She heard footsteps approach, calm and certain as always, and the door swung open without hesitation. Aidan paused when he saw her standing there fully dressed. For the first time, there was the smallest flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Good morning," he said slowly, studying her face. "You're ready early." "Yes," she answered, her voice steady. "I'm ready." He smiled, as if they shared some private joke. "I'm glad to hear it. Today will be important for both of us." He offered his hand. She didn't take it. She simply stepped past him, out into the hall. Her chin lifted high. She didn't look back to see if he was angry or amused. It didn't matter anymore. Downstairs, the house was bright with the kind of ordinary, civilized morning he loved: coffee brewing, polished silver glinting on the table, the staff moving quietly from room to room. She walked through it like a stranger passing through someone else's dream. When they reached a sitting room, he stopped her with a touch to her elbow. His hand was warm, gentle, possessive. "Have you thought about what I said?" he asked softly. She turned and met his gaze without flinching. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled, slow and careful and utterly empty. "I have." And in that moment, she saw the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, the flicker of something he couldn't quite hide. He didn't trust her anymore. He was beginning to understand she would never be the compliant ornament he wanted. It was the only victory she had, and it was enough. Because she knew she would leave him. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but she would never stop planning. Never stop looking for that door he forgot to lock. Never stop gathering every scrap of courage until the day came when she could walk out and never look back. Until then, she would keep smiling. She would keep pretending. But inside, she would keep saying the words she had written in her secret notebook, over and over like a prayer. "I am still here." And he would never ever break her. Thank you for joining me on this intense journey of love twisted into control, of a woman's spirit tested beyond measure. She married a loving husband until the wedding night changed everything is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous prisons are not built of walls and locks, but of lies, manipulation, and the illusion of devotion. Yet even in the darkest captivity, the human spirit can endure, because no matter how carefully someone tries to erase who you are, there is always a part of you that remains watching, waiting, and ready to fight back. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of resilience, betrayal, and the quiet strength that can outlast even the most perfect facade. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never let anyone steal your voice.